we got a lot to talk about with regards to the work you're doing and the company you started, Wild Health, and your podcast and all that. But I always start by just really wanting the listeners to get a sense for who you are as a human being rather than jumping right into the tools, principles, technologies. And so where'd you grow up? You said you're from Kentucky. What were some of your formative experiences? What shaped you as a human being?
Sure, yeah.
Mentors, traumas, parents, let's hit the highlights.
Yeah, I grew up in Kentucky. Growing up, I kind of played every sports and was really obsessed with performance in general. And that's really kind of what led me into healthcare in general. So small town in Kentucky. I ended up playing a couple sports in college. I went to medical school from there, and again was fairly obsessed. I really didn't have any talent at all playing sports.
That's
and kind
funny.
of
I feel the same way. I was good at swimming, but that just required me to go in a straight line,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
get
I was
in good
pretty much
shape.
good at working hard and thinking, and that was about it. So I had to use that as
What were your
much as I
parents
could.
like? Were they as an influence?
My parents were the two greatest people I've ever met. So
Awesome.
when you mentioned trauma, I thought, oh man, I'm not going to have a hard time coming up with that because
Okay, you're one of the lucky ones. Good job.
I am. Yeah. I had an incredible foundation, and my dad was a chaplain of the fire department here in Lexington for 20 years. My mom was a teacher, and just wonderful.
Did you have
people.
one of those volunteer fire departments like we had in upstate New York that the bell would go off if there was a fire, the siren, and everyone would get in the car and go drive to the drive to the place? And
Yeah, in the small town where I grew up, we did. My dad ended up working in a larger city in Lexington,
okay,
but yeah, volunteer in the small little town I grew up in.
that's such a cool thing. Okay, how big was your town?
Couple thousand people, so you pretty much knew
huge
everybody.
Compared to mine. I had 375.
Oh yeah, we're big
upstate
cities.
New York. Yeah, that's a big city. I get a sense for though, you're Kentucky. That's farther south than I was, but growing up in those small towns really does talk about a formative influence in and of itself. Like you said, a lot of the people. There's really nowhere to hide. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
It's so different than growing up in a big city.
Yeah, integrity is critical. I learned that from my parents. When everybody knows everybody, you kind of have to treat everyone incredibly well. You can't hide, like you said. You can't get away with things, and so I think it was an incredible upbringing.
Yeah, the town becomes. Not that I really loved Hillary Clinton's policies or anything, but when she said it takes a village, she was actually accurate there, right? And she was talking about that small town kind of idea that everyone takes a little bit of responsibility for raising the children in the town, because if you see someone going off the rails, you're gonna tighten them up, and the parents are gonna know about it right away, and and if you do something bad, the cop isn't gonna just bust you right away. He's gonna help you.
Yeah, and call your parents because he knows your parents. Right. Like your parents know every policeman, teacher, fireman, everyone else. So yeah,
it'd be nice if we can get back to that. Kind of a more decentralized and authentic way of organizing our culture. That's a separate subject, for another day, maybe.
It's a long topic.
It's a long topic, I know. Okay, so great. You went to school. Did you go to college down there in Kentucky as well?
Yeah, I did. I initially went to a small school. I got scholarship offers in soccer and tennis, which were my two least favorite sports, but the only ones I was good enough to play. And then I ended up going to the University of Kentucky for the last half of my undergrad and also medical school.
Okay. So you went straight from college into medical school there, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. When, no time off. I knew what I wanted to do. I told my mom when I was 5 years old what I wanted to do. So not really a lot of time trying to find myself or taking time off between college.
I'm curious if you ever, I did the same thing. Not in medical school, even though I went to Colgate as pre-med. This is a kind of a funny story. Because I was from this tiny little town, I didn't really have, the academics were pretty Mark I motto. You know what I mean? There was no AP classes. There was no curves. It was just super basic. Most of the kids in my town were farmers or, blue collar workers, which is great. But I think 4 of us in my college or my high school went on to college. So then I go from that little podunk high school into Colgate, which is a pretty rigorous academic institution. And I'm pre-med thinking, I'm going to be a doctor because my mom wanted me to be a doctor. So there I am in freshman year, taking biology, calculus, English, and physics. And, I'm muddling through. And the physics I actually really liked, right? But they didn't have any
Mhm.
quizzes. There was no kind of benchmarks to know how you're doing. So I get to the midterm, and I literally just just gloriously bombed this thing. You know what I mean? I'd never done so poorly on a test before. And so I was terrified. I was like, oh shit, obviously I'm not cut out for this. So I went to the freshman dean who was brand new, and he says, yeah, you probably should drop the class. Go talk to the prof first. And I went to the prof, and he was this Iranian guy who barely spoke English, and he had too many people in his class. He goes, yeah, you should drop the class. So I dropped the class. And anyways, I had a friend, a guy I knew in the class, but just getting to know then, but we joined the same fraternity, and we were both swimmers. And so at the end of the year, after we pledged this fraternity, we're just hanging around, drinking beer probably. And I'm like, hey, Chris, whatever happened to that physics class? I mean, how'd you do? Because I bombed that freaking midterm. He goes, oh yeah, so did I. He goes, I got a 20 on it. And he had to curve the whole class. And I'm like, you're shitting me. What's a curve? And he goes, what's a curve? I said, yeah, what's a curve? And so he told me what a curve is. And I'm like, holy shit, I got a 40 on that test. He goes, dude, you had one of the highest grades in the class.
You're at the top of the class.
Wow. I was at the top of the class.
Horrible.
And it ended my pre-med career. So obviously it was meant to be. At least that's my story. Because I wouldn't have made a good doctor anyways. Isn't that funny? So, but you made it. Pre-med. And then the other thing I wanted to ask is, did you ever have any regrets for not taking some time off to like travel the world or do something between college and, because I did. I went from Colgate right into my MBA with like 3 or 4 weeks between. And I always wish I had taken some time.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when I grew up, I had the best parents in the world, but I mean, we didn't have much. I mean, there were times growing up we were kind of at or below the poverty line, and so for me, it was kind of just getting through and getting it paid for and things like that. I never had a regret when it came to that. It's funny. Now that you mention it, what I tell people, the only regret I've ever had is I seriously considered kind of a military route and special forces. And I know that's like, you have that background. That was the one thing that I've always looked back and said, hey, was that good enough? Could I have done that? I obviously love a challenge. And I was really close to that, but I knew I wanted to be a doctor, and it seemed like a circuitous path and not really couldn't do both. And that was maybe the only regret I've ever had.
Yeah, one of my good friends is a Navy SEAL doctor now. It does happen. And there's an astronaut now who was a Navy SEAL, went to Harvard Medical School, and then now he's in the astronaut program. But don't hold on to regret. Regrets suck. You need to let those things go.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, not helpful.
So what kind of doctor did you want to be, and what kind did you become?
Yeah, so I the only thing that did not bore me when I actually got into the hospital, because I kind of have ADHD. I'm always doing a lot of things, was the emergency department. I fell in love with the emergency department, just the intensity of it, having kind of life and death situations constantly in front of you. And so that's what I went into and specialized at first. And that's what I did until I found precision medicine and just became obsessed with the science of actually doing personalized medicine for people. So I practiced in the ER for about a decade.
Okay.
Yeah, and really loved it. It was, it's such a privilege.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, you're a frontline. Gosh, I mean, that is service, right? That is intense. It's stressful. You're seeing just incredible trauma. Tell us, some of the highs and lows of that experience as an ER doctor. Like, what were some of the most challenging things that you experienced, and what were some of the most beautiful and rewarding things?
Yeah, it is such a privilege and a rewarding thing to be able to meet people, usually during the worst day of their life.
Right.
And you're there and you're able to provide comfort, maybe save their life, do something for them. So it is a really incredible privilege. It's not always easy. The most difficult thing was, you would have a child that died, and then you tell their parents, and then seconds later you're having to see another patient with a complaint, and you have to bury that. There's no time, right. There's no grieving process for you, and that accumulates. It becomes difficult on ER physicians and nurses, and you get really good at compartmentalizing and suppressing things. that doesn't
Hmm.
always serve you later in the
Right.
rest of your life.
That's interesting. So, what type of mental tools did you develop to navigate, to stay calm, to stay focused, to deal with these kind of ups and downs, and also to make sure that you weren't going to eat yourself alive with some of these, by suppressing some of these traumas?
I think people who have a natural tendency and ability to that tend to gravitate towards emergency medicine. So,
Hmm.
I mean, it was the same thing in my athletics career. I mean, I was a goalkeeper. I always liked the most highest pressure scenarios. And interestingly enough, I found out later when I looked at my DNA with kind of what we're doing, I have a very specific SNP on the fatty acid amide hydrolase gene that's very rare that
Really?
makes it to where I don't really feel anxiety and stress as much. So I think I had a natural proclivity, and then just over time you get used to it. So I can't point to any specific training I had. I think the genetic predisposition and the athletics kind of inoculated for that a
Right.
little bit, and
I guess you
people were
could
just
say the
drawn.
athletics was training in a sense.
Yeah, I
Or
think so.
and also I wonder, and maybe you have can shed some light on this, is that like genetic expression, through that athleticism,
Hmm.
right? Was it the gene? Did it look like that before the athletics, or was it a result of the athletics? I think that's really interesting to me. But
Yeah,
then we can come
yeah.
back to that because I know that's kind of the focus of your work now with wild health and whatnot. But um, I still want to stick with this. So, what led you from being an ER doc and really thriving in that to wanting to shift out of it to what you now call, or what's now known as personalized medicine, which, by the way, it's got to be a pretty new thing. I mean, isn't it? I know people have been talking about it for a while, but the ability to actually do it
Hmm.
technologically is pretty recent.
Yeah. No, you nailed it. And so, even in emergency medicine, early on, I spent a lot of time teaching other physicians. So, medicine is
Okay.
always about 20 years behind the science. And so,
Is it?
my uh, my co-founder of Wild Health and I, we were teaching other doctors a technologically advanced skill called point of care ultrasound. That was the evidence was really good there for it, but no one was doing it. And we just kind of saw the science ahead when it comes to that. That was really exciting. We started a nonprofit. We made a big difference with that. Taught a lot of physicians, but the actual work in the ER, it kind of grinds on you. And honestly, not as much of the what I mentioned about kind of the child and then going to the next patient, but you just see the same patients over and over, and you
Right.
realize you may save their life or like put a band-aid on something, and then they come back. Like the root cause, the upstream effect. I heard a great analogy, a story of someone who was standing in a certain place in the river, and people were floating down, and he'd see them, he'd jump in and save them, pull them out, jump in, save them, pull them out, and finally he walked upriver to figure out who was throwing these people in, and that's how I felt in the ER. It's like we're pulling these people out, but like why don't we teach them how to not get in this situation?
I love that.
And when we saw the science that, like, hey, look, people have been talking about personalized medicine for a decade, the science exists and no one's doing it. We were the kind of folks who couldn't just not do anything. And we kind of went all in with that.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that. So I wonder, because I'm in an academic program right now to get my doctorate in leadership, which is kind
Mm.
of a social science, but it's got enough rigor that it's kicking my ass. But it's probably nothing compared to, like a hard science, obviously. But there are the researchers and then there are the doers, and like you said, that oftentimes they operate in completely different worlds, right?
Mhm.
So unless you take the time out of your ridiculous schedule as an ER doctor to be going to conferences and to be reading the publications, you just don't really know. And I
Yeah.
found that to be true. Like with my doctors, I'm like, dude, have you heard about this? Have you heard about that? And they're like, nope, 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 nope. I'm like, you're kidding me.
Hmm.
Really? Like,
Yeah.
huh?
Yeah.
Like
No, you,
nutrition is a great example, right? Nutrition. Most people just have no clue about
yeah,
anything about nutrition in the medical profession because they're just not taught.
you're
And
exactly
I know
right.
it's. I know I'm speaking very generally. So if you're a doctor and you know a lot about nutrition, then forgive me. But generally speaking, and then you have the
Yeah.
FDA, of course, which is pretty corrupted. That's still not willing to change their standards on sugar when the when it's so obvious that this is just basically a drug that's doing so much damage. Anyways, I went off on a little tangent there, but I can see how the technology, the tools, and the application really does trail the science, but it shouldn't, right? There really should be much more of a, you know, like in the military, a hand in glove, approach between those who are doing their cutting edge research and those who are applying it.
Yeah, and that's that gap between the science and then actually putting it into practice. That's where we've kind of stood, that translation of the science to actually put it
Right.
into practice. And there is in medicine, we're dealing with people's lives and their health, and so there is some good to being cautious and waiting for evidence to
True.
kind of accumulate. But it is way too slow. The translation has been the problem, and that's what we try to do, is actually translate science and get it out there more quickly.
So let's talk about some of the things that you saw that, led to kind of the innovations that you're working with now at Wild Health.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like walk us down the path of your discoveries and the impact it was having with people.
Sure. So we saw the science was there. We saw that you could actually look at someone's DNA and tell an incredible amount about them, like what foods they should eat, what foods they shouldn't eat, and what medications will work or which ones won't, how they should actually exercise, all this incredible information about lifestyle and medicine and risk factors, but no one was doing it. So we initially, when we started, we just sequenced our own DNA. And
right.
as we
Is
did
that
this,
easy to do these days?
it is. So,
Is it?
even just 23andMe or Ancestry.com, they don't sequence your entire genome, but they look at hundreds of thousands of SNPs, of these single nucleotide polymorphisms. So you can just do that for a couple $100 and then download the raw data. So they don't really tell you anything about it. That's the difficulty. So we did that, downloaded our raw data, and then combed through that over an enormous amount of time to really get the actionable insights we wanted. Now, Mike, my co-founder and partner, as we were doing this, he had actually kind of a difficult medical issue that came up. His lipids were through the roof, like not just a little elevated, but kind of at a dangerous level, kind of a familial thing that he had. And his doctor told him to do a certain diet. He got worse. His doctor put him on a medication for it. He got muscle breakdown, myopathy. And this is, he's an athletic guy too. We were doing ultra marathons and doing stuff, and it was a bad situation. And when we looked at his DNA, we saw almost immediately that he needed to be on the opposite diet his doctor had put him on. Right. We saw that he had a specific polymorphism that made him pretty much guaranteed to have that bad reaction to the medication. And when we saw this, we're like, why did his doctor not know this or do this? Why he didn't have to suffer? And then we did, like a light bulb went off, and we realized, okay, nobody's doing this. Like we're the only ones looking at this. Like this is.
How do you make the leap from seeing someone's genetic markers or code and knowing what diet, what medications, how do you make that link? Where's the science there?
As I mentioned, there are thousands of studies. So that was the difficult part, kind of collating all those and pulling them together. Just to give you examples, Mike, he has an incredible, that's who I was just speaking about. He has a really large number of FTO, PPAR alpha, PPAR gamma SNPs. So what that means is he's very sensitive to saturated fats, whereas I don't have any of those. So what we found when we looked at our DNA, I needed to be on a very kind of animal heavy kind of keto diet to optimize all my numbers. He needed to be on more of a plant-based diet, almost like almost vegan. And when we saw that was kind of a aha moment for us too, because you hear all these, like, it's almost like religious wars when people talk about diets. Everyone is convinced their diet is the best. And the reason they're convinced of that is because they finally found what works for them. Exactly. Right. And we did all these experiments with ourselves where we would eat the exact same thing for 2 days and watch our glucose numbers, our ketone numbers, measure our inflammatory markers. And it was fascinating to see how we responded perfectly to very different diets.
Yeah, I think that's so important for people to hear again, is that no one diet fits any one person perfectly, right? It's like, it really is, what you're doing is the future. It's like personalized nutrition, but it's difficult to do, of course. I was part of a company co-founded by Craig Vertner and Peter Diamandis called Human Longevity. You familiar with them?
Yeah, I am. Yeah,
they're like the pioneers in kind of this personalized medicine. But it was like caveman. Like it cost me $5,000 to have my genome sequence. This is like 13 or 14 years ago. And then they did a bunch of other tests, cognitive tests, MRI, and all that kind of stuff. And they couldn't have told me anything like what you just told me. In fact, they didn't. They just said, you're one of the healthiest guys we've ever studied. Thanks for the genome. and you have you're predisposed for two things, Raynaud's and Dupuytren syndrome. And I was like, yeah, got them both. Check. And they said, you're supposed to have red hair. And I said, I do. And they're like, oh. And that's all I learned. I'm like, aren't you going to tell me like how I'm supposed to eat? And I'm like, it didn't have the technology then.
Yeah, no, we get incredible action. I mean, for myself, I was at the time I was doing Ironmans, and I just continued to get injured. And what I saw in my DNA, I already mentioned the dietary part, but also several things. One, I had this collagen 5A1 polymorphism that meant I was at much higher risk for tendon and ligament injuries if I didn't eat a lot more collagen protein. So I increased my collagen protein. All those went completely away. Like my joints are perfect now, like 10 years later when they were killing me a decade before. I also saw that kind of had all these SOD2 and these other SNPs around inflammation, and then I needed to do lower volume. So I started doing lower volume and my performance went up. I saw that I needed to be more kind of endurance based than strength based. So I changed kind of the rep numbers and the weights in the weight room. Strength went up. It kind of thing after thing when it comes to that. Caffeine is a perfect one, perfect example. We just had an NBA player recently was working with. And so with caffeine, we've been taught for decades that it's a good ergogenic aid. It makes people perform better. But what the evidence actually shows is if you have a certain genetic predisposition, you're a fast metabolizer, you improve your performance. If you're an intermediate version, no change. And if you're a slow metabolizer, it hurts your performance.
Really?
So with this NBA guy, like he was doing what everyone else is doing for games, Red Bulls, caffeine, and it was crushing his performance and it was hurting his sleep. When we looked at his sleep genetics, he was doing all of these things wrong with his sleep. So it's just like actionable insight after actionable insight with supplements, medications, exercise, food, sleep. It's an incredible amount of information that we can actually give people now.
Do you get involved at all in assessing the biome instead of the genome?
We do. Yeah. So when what we do is everyone we sequence their DNA. We look at about 675,000 SNPs. We do a really large blood panel and biomarkers, much bigger than a doctor will ever order normally. We also can do microbiome testing when people want that, and all of that information. And we also collect data from people's wearables and questionnaires. And we take these millions of data points and bring them all into AI engine and algorithm. And all of that affects the recommendations. So like if I'm talking to you about food, well, I'll use my mother as a perfect example. She had when she first came to us, she was quite overweight, insulin resistance, a lot of issues. And I was seeing her because she had a genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's as well. My grandmother had that. So we found that genetic predisposition. But as we're talking about what to eat, she has a VDR SNP. That means she may need more vitamin D. But then we also look at what is her vitamin D with the blood marker, and then take into account, is it summer, is it winter, where is it? And then the AI engine can spit out, are we going to fix this just with food? Is there nothing to fix? Do we need to supplement? And we kind of combine all the information, and microbiome is part of that.
So the output of this, is it a recommendation of a do this, do that kind of recommendation, or do you get involved in the more direct intervention,
Yeah, both. So to start, it is kind of about a 50-page report with all the recommendations. Okay, here's the perfect diet. Here's the perfect exercise plan. We'll modify according to their goals. Here's the supplements that'll probably work, sleep, mindfulness. Even mindfulness, there's specific SNPs saying, okay, loving kindness meditation will probably be better for this person, or based on their COMT gene. Yeah, so
interesting.
Really comprehensive. So there's a report, but we also, every patient that we see gets a physician and a health coach, because the report is incredible, but it's really about the execution on that and someone holding them accountable and translating the science. So we give them all the recommendations, but then we also want to set up, okay, we see that you need to do this to improve your sleep, but let's set an objective marker. We're going to put a wearable on you, and here's where we want your deep sleep and REM sleep to be. Let's do these N-of-1 experiments based on the data, and then let's report back and let's adjust. So it's an iterative process too, so that over time, the physician and health coach who knows how to use this data gets even better results than if we just handed someone a report.
Right. That's pretty interesting. So I mentioned earlier that Ben was the one who referred us. Ben Greenfields is a friend of mine too. Did you do this with Ben?
Yeah, we did. Yeah,
Yeah.
we've done it
So I'm
with.
curious. Because Ben, I'm sure like he's even more insane than I am by far. I should say. God bless you, Ben. And I'm willing to bet he's like, man, I'm super dialed in. Because I'm like, I am a superhuman being, and I'm doing everything, and I've studied all this stuff to the gnat's ass. And so, what was what was surprising about your findings with Ben?
Yeah, there were things. I apologize. Like our work is a little different in that we have like all these HIPAA guidelines and privacy guidelines.
Oh,
So
you can't
I could,
really tell,
yeah,
can you?
and I
Oh,
and I can
shucks,
only,
that would be so much fun.
yeah,
I mean,
it
darn.
would be, and I can only even say that he's done it just because he's talked about it
Right.
publicly too. So yeah, it's frustrating because I mean I think we've got dozens of like NFL and NBA and other players, and like I'd love to talk about
I'm
them for
sure Ben would have
promotion.
no problem us having the conversation, but I get it. I get it.
No,
It's
I'm
against
sure
the
he
law.
would. I should have
Oh, well,
asked
let's
him.
talk some generalities then. Like, what are some surprising findings you find? You mentioned the football guy, but like, what do you think you would find in me? Is there any way can you tell by like body type or like
Yeah.
generally speaking? I'm from Northern Europe. Like the genome test that I did said I was basically a Viking. It was
Right.
100% Northern European. I was like, well, that makes sense. I kind of feel like a Viking. My
Yeah.
Navy
Yeah.
SEAL.
For sure. Yeah. So I can give you kind of some patient examples. My grandmother was one of the first patients that we saw, and she had Alzheimer's disease. When we saw her, she kind of had moderate with a MoCA score of 16. And when we saw her, we saw she had some real genetic sensitivities to specific things like gluten. She had an SH2B3
Mm-hmm.
polymorphism, dairy because she had an MCM6 polymorphism, this PEMT saying she needed more choline. When it comes to exercise, she actually needed to be doing a lot more strength than she was doing. She obviously wasn't really doing any of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then when it comes to other
Not many
supplements,
grandmas are, by the way.
not many. Although my grandma was a little different. I remember when I was kind of in my early 30s, I went to help her on a house she was working on. We were doing drywall on the ceiling, and I remember
Nice.
she did put one up by herself, and I could not do it, and I was
No
just
kidding.
so embarrassed. So my grandma was a little different than than, than most
That's awesome.
grandmas. But once we changed all of those things in 3 months, she with Alzheimer's, you normally just want to slow the decline,
Mm-hmm.
and she actually had a 25% improvement, which was pretty incredible because most people think about, okay, what medication you're going to put someone sick
Right.
on. And we didn't do any of that. It was all lifestyle. We cleaned out her refrigerator for the foods that were kind of kryptonite for her.
Mm-hmm.
We added these superfoods that she wasn't getting enough. Like she had a FADS2 polymorphism, and that means she needs more omega-3 than most people. So we
Mm-hmm.
got her on a lot more fish and a fish oil supplement. Just little things like that really add up once you look at someone's genetics and for the first time tell them what they're really missing and what they really need.
Right. Yeah, I could see that compounding effect. If you were to
Mhm.
remove two or three things and add two or three things and change this behavior and end that behavior, you can't really point to like which one had the biggest effect. It's it's the confluence or the combination,
Yeah, people all the
the
time say like,
logarithmic effect.
yeah, they ask me like which of what is the most important intervention here, and I'm like, look, you don't look at a Picasso painting and say what's the most important color. It's bringing them all together is where you get the
Right.
power, the holistic approach.
That's so interesting because that's really one of the challenges I have with my training. Because our training is integrated development.
Mm,
We train physically, mentally, emotionally, intuitively, and spiritually, and we do it all together
mm,
in a kind of a petri dish kind of format. And what we found is it leads to like great strides in
yeah.
growth and awareness and development and healing and health. But you can't like study it very effectively, like because the mainstream medical community, academic community is all designed around like isolating that one factor, that one variable, and controlling for all the others. And the human being isn't like that,
Mm,
which is, I
no.
think, one of the reasons that our medical profession and the pharmacology profession is so harmful. It's because they're not looking at the whole. So it's really promising to see your work and the work of other people who are starting to look at the human being as a whole system and the whole being and solving for the whole instead of the part that's
Yeah.
broken.
Yeah, we're not a
That's good.
collection of organ systems. We're a whole person. And when someone has a headache, you don't just automatically think of the brain. You got to think about the whole system and take care of
Right.
everything. It's not that simple. But you're exactly right. The reason why medicine has started to do that is because of how science is done. You isolate these variables and see what works, what intervention works with this these specific variables. But I think John Muir said it best, and when he said, I'm paraphrasing, but something like anytime you try to isolate one thing and pull it out in nature, you find it connected to everything else. And that's how we really
That's
have to
right.
think about that as a system with everything connected.
Yeah, and also Heidegger's principle, by isolating and observing that one thing, you're changing
Yeah.
the nature of it, right? And so it's going to behave differently based
Yeah.
upon who's observing and when. And it's just so interesting.
Exactly right.
How so? Do you ever get to the point where you prescribe a pharmacological solution, or are you really just on the natural thing? I mean, with the name of your company, Wild Health, it would
Yeah.
point toward more natural. But what about pharma?
That's always the goal, is to fix the root cause. And honestly, medications usually don't do that. Medications
Right.
usually are kind of band-aids, but sometimes you need those. So
Right.
we are physicians who can prescribe. So we certainly put people on medications when they really need it, but we're looking at what is the root cause, how are we going to fix this while we're bridging you
Right.
to health, because the medication usually isn't what's going to give you health. We usually stop more medications than we put people on, but we're also very pragmatic. We're going to do what works and what the person. We have some people coming to us, they're just so broken that the medications are helpful to
It's a
get
more
us.
of an intervention, and you wean them off it maybe over time, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like if we start a medication, what's it for? What's our goal? How are we going to stop it? That's the kind of things you're thinking of.
Yeah. Interesting. I want to talk a little bit about longevity. So a couple years ago, I read David Sinclair's book. He's out of Harvard, and Lifespan. And he got me thinking about different supplements, and he even recommends, what is it?
So yeah.
Metformin,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And he says there's evidence that helps with, you know, reducing or slowing down aging and all this stuff. And I've got a hyperbaric chamber, right? And so there's some evidence coming out of Northern Europe about the effectiveness of the hyperbaric treatments for increasing telomere length and, supposedly reducing aging or reverting aging. I guess I'm not sure what that term is. So how do you guys deal with this idea of longevity when people come to you? Can you, what does the genome tell us about that?
Yeah, it tells us a lot. I mean, it definitely gives us clues. First off, just in someone's longevity markers. Obviously, we don't really care about those as much as what are we going to do about it.
Right.
David is great. David's been on our podcast and he spoke at our
As a,
conferences,
mm,
and I think he's definitely the leader in that field. Everyone is so individualized though. So I always feel like a broken record when I'm talking about it because it just depends on the person. I mean, metformin, you mentioned, is a great example. It clearly promotes longevity and leads to a really good outcome in people who have elevated hemoglobin A1C. However, we also work with a lot of athletes, and with metformin, it also decreases a little bit your ability to kind of gain strength and potentially muscle mass. So when it
mhm.
comes to putting someone on metformin for a longevity promotion, it depends on how old you are, what your goals are, what your A1C, what your genetics show.
Yeah, it's
It
not
varies.
probably not something for a 30-year-old. You shouldn't be thinking about longevity at 30 anyways, frankly, in my opinion. You should
Yeah,
be worrying
yeah.
about other things.
Yeah, well, it's great if you're thinking about it, but like the intervention, certainly you're exactly right. It's going to be completely different
Right.
interventions at 30 as compared to 50. But yeah, there's a lot when it comes to longevity that we focus on. We we're trying to think of people 30 years from now when we see them. Like,
Right.
what are the things we need to get ahead of now? Not just treating the problems you have, but preventing those problems. And the genomics helps us do that. Like we can see if someone has an ApoE4, they're very high risk for cardiovascular disease and dementia. So we really focus on the brain health and heart health and do extra interventions there. So the genomics are kind of a guideline to where we focus with interventions. David talks about a lot of the interventions you do, and we
Right.
use all of those, but we use them differently depending on the person and the circumstance.
Yeah. So it's just more, instead of generalizing, like David would, of course, all the behavioral things like meditation, exercise, sleep well, you know, um, hyperbaric chamber. But then he has the supplementation. He says resveratrol and NMN and metformin and quercetin and others. So those are like general ideas, but he does say, they may not work for everybody, but I'm going to do them,
Yeah.
as he said. And so I was like, okay, if you do it, I'm going to do them. So I've been working. I haven't had any contraindications or anything, but I don't have any evidence, except my wife says I'm certainly doing pretty well in a lot of areas. You know what I mean? Like physically looking pretty good for a 59-year-old. And my training is solid as can be. I can still train as hard as my SEAL candidates. So I think something's working. I don't know if that's just mindset or all of this is working together, but what are the, like, for the person who's like listening to this, who's like not ready to like call Wild Health up, what are the general things that we should be doing? All of us, it doesn't have to be personalized.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of them. I mean, obviously, sleep is just absolutely critical. I think that's extremely underrated. Everyone knows how important nutrition and exercise is, and everyone's starting to catch up on just how important sleep is. I think the one that people don't talk about enough, though, is the mindfulness and kind of stress and community. Those factors aren't as studied as much in medicine, but when they are, they just have profound effects on longevity. I mean, just being lonely, I think it's equivalent. I'd have to look up this exactly, but to smoking about a pack and a half of cigarettes a day.
I've heard that. That's crazy.
Those are some of the things I think people don't talk about enough because they're harder to study, but they have a massive impact on health.
Wow. You can't take a pill for ending loneliness.
You
have to get out there and interact with people and develop relationships and cultivate. Open your heart, I guess.
And that's why it's not been studied as much. There's no pharmaceutical company looking at studying for a pill for
loneliness. Yeah, they're not going to fund the study.
No.
That's fascinating.
No, that's right.
So if I wanted, I don't want this to sound like a commercial, but I'm actually really interested, especially since my first experience with this was like 14 years ago, and I paid $5,000 to get not much. How would I work with you if I wanted to? Like, what does it look like?
Yeah, it's changed a lot from when you did that. So first off, the costs are a lot less. When someone signs up with us, they sign up. We send a DNA kit to their house. It's a proprietary DNA. It's test for a lot more genes than a lot of other companies do. It's just a saliva test, though. We then order the blood test. They just go to a local lab and get that drawn. If they want the microbiome, that comes to their house, and we start collecting all of the data. And even when we first started a few years ago, probably 4 years ago, the costs were a lot more. But now, because we have the technology, the AI engines, and it's not an incredible amount of physician time, a lot of it is automated, it's much less expensive. It's around $100 a month. So it's extremely affordable. Whereas just getting the genome sequenced 10 years ago was in the thousands of dollars. So it's much less expensive. And then someone continues with a physician and a coach over the course of a year to kind of achieve those goals that they have and reduce the risk factors that we identify they may not have realized they needed to work on.
Mm-hmm. So that would be a different, like, more of a concierge doctor type relationship.
Yeah, and we have a really high level concierge program as well. That's more for kind of pro athletes and executives who want kind of 24/7 physician, health coach, and a care coordinator. And it also includes like whole body MRI scans, advanced AI cardiac imaging, micronutrient testing, just kind of tens of thousands of dollars worth of tests and things. So we do have, I don't talk about that program as much. I don't even know if it's listed on our website because it's expensive.
That's for the CEOs and the entrepreneurs who are just like, okay, no stone unturned. I want the best to take care of my health.
Yeah. It's the exec. I mean, you hear the stories all the time about the executive dropping dead of a heart attack and having no idea. And it's people that want insurance against cancer and heart attack, and then also to optimize on a different level.
I'm going to ask a question which I've never asked on a podcast because, it was taboo up until like I decided screw it. But I have 4 friends who died of a heart attack in the last year and a half, and I'm quite convinced it was from this vaccine. And I've been reading about the issues of myocardial arrest or myocardial infractions or whatever they're called, especially among young people. The incidences are like up significantly, like not radically statistically significantly. So what's your experience with that? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of that. Yeah, I mean, if any, it certainly could be there, but I haven't seen any evidence of
You
that.
haven't seen in your practice, you haven't.
We haven't, not in our practice or just anything published. So I mean,
You're dealing with a very healthy population too, I might add. Yeah.
we are in general,
Yeah.
it's a population that wants to optimize. And we also get, it's interesting, both spectrums. We get people who are very sick and haven't had any success with the regular system. And then we get people who just want to optimize as
Got it.
well, who are normally pretty well, but we haven't seen that in our practice, at least.
Did you think that vaccine was safe, the mNRA one?
So I tend to not think as much as just look at all the evidence that's put out there.
Yeah.
And when it comes to things like that, because it's just so hard to
True.
evaluate
It's hard
that.
to find the evidence, or it's
Yeah,
hard to find unbiased studies too on
that's
both
exactly
sides.
right. Yeah, it's extremely hard to. And I mean, when I look at other vaccines in the past versus this one and how many people actually got it and the studies at least look very safe. Now, if you don't believe the studies, then you don't believe the studies.
Yeah.
But that's all I kind of have to go on right now is
Yeah.
looking at what's published and out there.
Yeah. That's good to hear. What about, we're going to wrap up soon here, but I want to talk about the future of personalized medicine, with like, we're just getting warmed up with what's going to be possible with AI and personalization. What does it look like to you in 10 years or 20 years?
Yeah, yeah, and I love the saying that the future is here; it's just unevenly distributed.
Yeah.
I think what we're doing is the future, but we want to create that future. So, as I mentioned, we were translating, we were kind of standing in the gap of what's already the science that's there and what no one is doing. So, but our next phase as a company, so we were acquired by a publicly traded AI company in February. And what
Wow.
that's allowed us to do is they were named the most innovative AI company in the world by Fast Company. So what that's allowing us to do is really put AI, machine learning, looking at our algorithms. And now instead of just translating based on the science, like we should do this for this person because of this DNA and blood work, we're actually able to look at big data sets and create science, like see interactions between, oh, this has not been published, but when someone has this constellation of genes and they do these activities and take these supplements, this happens. So that
Mhm.
acceleration, we've tried to translate and pull the science from behind 20 years to come up to date, but then accelerating that and creating the science is the next thing. And we're developing, we just released an app as well that will eventually kind of be like an AI assistant and give you constant daily reminders. And you may wake up and right now we already track all of your wearables and it may say, hey, Mark, your HRV is down 20%, your body temperature's up a little bit. You're probably going to be sick tomorrow. But then it also may say you did a hard workout yesterday and you're just overtrained a little bit, but it has that data on your genomics, what your workout was yesterday, this other data, and it can predict you're getting sick or you need to slow down or you're going to overtrain and get an injury. But that predictive power is what I'm really excited about. And we're just right there and doing it right now.
And how far are we from personalized food? That where,
Mm-hmm.
the genome says, okay, this is exactly how Mark needs to eat. And then there's going to be a company that ships that food to my door, or, somehow it gets into my belly.
Yeah. So we can tell you that right now. We name kryptonite foods, superfoods, things like that, kind of dietary things in general. As far as the shipping, we've looked at different companies who can potentially do that. We have
Mhm.
recipes and things that we can give our patients, kind of personalized things. We haven't partnered with any company that ships it, but I totally hear you. I
It's
think
coming,
that
huh?
that should,
Wouldn't that be red?
it would. Yeah. Just to get that delivered to you, just based specifically on your
It's like a
microbiome.
nutritional insurance policy.
Yeah, it'd be incredible. Right now, we help people figure out like how to shop, what to buy, what recipes, but to have it delivered to you would be the next level for sure.
Yeah. Uh, Last question. This is more just kind of curiosity, and I think listeners would be interested. You're obviously very intelligent and on the cutting edge in your field, but in general, what do you think about the state of the world, and are you optimistic or neutral or pessimistic about the future in the next 10, 20 years, culturally and kind of globally?
I think I was just kind of born an optimist, and I totally, when I look at the news and look around, I see the problems. I don't have my head buried in the sand, but at the same time, I talk to people like you. I talk to our patients. I talk to others, and I people talk about us being on the precipice of these horrible things. Sure, I think we have been for all of time and eternity, but we also are just so connected now, and the science is kind of progressing. I think it's going to go in a positive direction. And if I'm wrong, well, it was kind of fun thinking thinking that way.
Yeah, at least
In the
you'll be
meantime.
healthy on the way down.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll be prepared if bad stuff happens. But yeah, I think we're headed in a good direction.
I agree. And I obviously believe that we create our own worlds. So it's really up to us to choose that future and to make it happen, right?
That's exactly right. I love that.
So, and these conversations and being able to have like your podcast, Wild Health Podcast, and Mark Devine Show, and Ben Greenfield, and all these other, I believe that, and I say this kind of quite often, it's becoming more of like a tagline for me, is that for the first time that we know in human history, we get to scale consciousness, right?
Yeah.
By having these conversations and by thinking more positively and acting more positively at a global scale. And that's what's, so we can modify Gandhi's statement to be the change you want to see in the world, but to be the change we want to see in the world at scale.
Yeah, that's
going
amazing.
to make it happen.
Throw an at scale on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Matthew, it's been a great conversation. I'm really interested. So when we sign off here, I want to talk to you about doing this myself. And I really appreciate your time and all that you're doing. And so Wild Health is the name of the company. That's the name of your podcast too, right?
It is. So wildhealth.com is where everything is found. I got an email right before this that they had created a code Mark 20 so people could get 20% off.
Oh, cool.
If you're interested.
Mark 20. Thank you.
And
that's awesome.
And that should work for as being a patient. We also, you mentioned scaling consciousness. We have a series of events in the first quarter on awareness and waking up and consciousness.
Nice.
And we also have a fellowship. We've trained hundreds of providers in how to do this. But I think that Mark 20 should work for conference.
Where do you do those conferences?
All around. So I randomly have a castle in Kentucky on 110 acres, which is a farm too. So we'll do some stuff there. We'll be in Austin with Ryan Holiday and some others.
I know Ryan. He's a good guy. I like him a lot.
And a few other places around the country.
I'll have to check that out too. It'd be fun to see you in person.
Yeah.
All right.
Wonderful.
Matthew. And so what about social media or working, besides coming to your companies, or a place that people can connect and kind of stay engaged in the conversation?
Yeah. I'm an old man and I always forget our social media handles. I think it's at Wild Health MD. I'm 99%. Sure.
You do everything through the company. So it's not you don't have a personal platform like Ben does.
I don't really, I've been told I should for years. But I have 4 kids as well as companies to run. And so I have,
I applaud your decision. Stick with it. It's a pain in the neck.
Yeah, seems like it for sure.
It sure is. All right. Thanks again, Matthew. Appreciate it very much. Hoo-yah.
Thank you.